My daughter-in-law poured glue on my wife's chair and sneered, "Let's see how that old woman gets up." My son laughed and said, "Dad, don't spoil the joke." I said nothing. I just switched the chairs. Hours later, the MC called the bride and groom to stand. What happened next left the entire ballroom in stunned silence. The very first symptom of my son's cowardice did not manifest in a shouting match or a sudden violent rebellion. It arrived in the form of a quiet, sickening complicity. I stood in the shadowed alcove of the service hallway, watching the boy I had raised guard a set of heavy mahogany ballroom doors. Through the crack, his bride was busy pouring a steady, clear stream of industrial cyanoacrylate adhesive onto the seat of a tufted velvet chair. It was the chair reserved for his own mother. Daniel caught my reflection in the gilded mirror hanging just outside the room. A brief flash of panic crossed his features, quickly swallowed by a conspiratorial smirk. He raised a single finger to his lips and whispered, "Don't ruin the joke, Dad." A cold dread coiled in my gut, heavy and suffocating. A joke. That was what he called the premeditated humiliation of the woman who had given him everything. My wife, Elena, was a woman carved from patience and quiet endurance. For 29 years, she had anchored our family. When Daniel struggled through middle school, she took on weekend nursing shifts to pay for specialized tutors. When his first ill-advised tech startup collapsed in a heap of debts, she didn't hesitate to mortgage our beloved lake house, her sole sanctuary, so he could wipe the slate clean and try again. She loved him with a fierce, blinding grace. Yet the moment Vanessa entered his life, a tectonic shift occurred. Daniel began treating his mother not as a matriarch to be revered, but as an embarrassing, antiquated relative he was socially obligated to tolerate. Vanessa was a creature of sharp edges and synthetic charm. She hailed from a family that prized appearance over substance, and she wasted no time dissecting Elena's character. She called my wife country, a word she dragged out with a sneer. She openly mocked Elena's gentle, regional accent. Just 3 weeks prior to the wedding, Vanessa had stood in our kitchen, sipping our wine, and remarked to a bridesmaid loudly enough for Elena to hear, "Daniel's mother actually thinks those cheap freshwater pearls make her look classy." I had watched Daniel's reaction that evening. He hadn't defended his mother. He had simply chuckled, staring down at his phone. That hollow, breathless laugh had wounded Elena far more deeply than Vanessa's venom ever could. It felt as if a fault line had cracked open right through my chest. Now, the grand culmination of their courtship was unfolding at Hawthorne Hall, a sprawling, ivy-draped estate boasting manicured gardens and crystal chandeliers. Vanessa strutted through the venue with the arrogance of royalty, firmly believing that Daniel had negotiated a massive discount through a wealthy, distant family friend. She also firmly believed that I, Robert Sterling, was nothing more than a retired mid-level accountant who spent his twilight years aggressively pruning hydrangeas and arguing with cashiers over expired grocery coupons. I had spent the last 2 years actively encouraging that mundane illusion. For 3.5 decades, I had meticulously built a quiet, fiercely lucrative commercial property empire under the umbrella of Aegis Holdings, a corporate entity that deliberately carried no trace of my surname. Daniel knew I possessed a comfortable nest egg, but he possessed absolutely no concept of its true depth. More crucially, he remained blissfully ignorant of a vital reality. The sprawling suburban house he currently lived in, the sleek downtown office building his logistics company occupied, and the generous trust fund currently subsidizing his lavish lifestyle were all assets legally controlled by my signature alone. Inside the ballroom, Vanessa gave the bottle of superglue a final, vicious squeeze across the crushed velvet of Elena's designated seat. She stepped back, admiring her handiwork, and smirked. "Just imagine the look on her face when the MC asks her to stand for the toasts," Vanessa giggled, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Daniel covered his mouth, his shoulders shaking as he suppressed a laugh. "It's going to be brutal." I remained perfectly still in the shadows, my breathing shallow, waiting until they abandoned their post and hurried toward the bridal suite to prepare for the grand entrance. Once the corridor was empty, I stepped into the empty ballroom. The pungent chemical tang of the adhesive stung the air. I did not shout. I did not storm upstairs to demand answers. Years of ruthless, high-stakes lease negotiations had etched a singular philosophy into my bones. Anger merely generates noise, but cold, hard evidence dictates decisions. Instead of reacting, I pulled out my phone and photographed the desecrated chair. I photographed the discarded glue bottle resting near a floral arrangement. I then stepped back into the hallway and photographed the discreet security camera mounted directly above the service entrance. Moving with deliberate, mechanical efficiency, I lifted Elena's ruined chair and swapped it with the pristine one placed directly to Daniel's left, Vanessa's chair. I slipped away, locating the venue manager in his office. I instructed him to freeze and heavily encrypt every second of the estate's security footage from the past 48 hours. By the time I returned to the cocktail hour on the terrace, Elena was admiring the sunset, completely unaware of the poison simmering beneath the surface of her son's wedding. Hours later, the reception was in full swing. The ballroom glittered beneath a canopy of suspended floral arrangements. Champagne flowed like a river, and laughter echoed off the marble marble pillars. Vanessa sat beside my son, her smile radiant, radiating the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had masterfully engineered one final, crushing humiliation for her mother-in-law. Then, the master of ceremonies tapped his microphone, the feedback ringing through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed cheerfully, "before we begin service, I'd like to ask the bride and groom to please stand so we can properly toast the new Mr. and Mrs. Sterling." Daniel rose smoothly to his feet, raising his glass. Vanessa placed her hands on the table and pushed herself upward. She didn't make it far. Before I could even blink, a sharp, horrific ripping sound, like a sail tearing in a hurricane, violently cut through the ambient jazz music playing in the background. The radiant, triumphant smile vanished from Vanessa's face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She jerked forward, but the back of her custom-tailored $20,000 silk gown remained brutally fused to the velvet upholstery. As she struggled, several major seams along her waistline and spine tore open with a sickening pop. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the room. 200 guests fell dead silent. At a table nearby, someone dropped a silver dessert fork. It clattered against a porcelain plate, sounding as loud as a gunshot. Vanessa wildly clawed backward, frantically clutching the heavy linen tablecloth behind her to cover her exposed back, her face flushing an aggressive, mottled crimson. Through the sea of shocked faces, her wide, horrified eyes desperately scanned the head table. They bypassed Daniel. They bypassed the bridesmaids. They locked directly onto mine. I did not flinch. I simply lifted my crystal glass of sparkling water, offering her a microscopic, agonizingly slow nod of acknowledgement. She knew immediately. The realization hit her like a physical blow. But as she stood there, trembling in the wreckage of her vanity, what she completely failed to comprehend was that the superglue was merely the opening gambit. It was the absolute smallest trap lying in wait for her that evening. Chaos erupted in hushed, frantic whispers. Vanessa burst into tears, yanking the chair up with her as she shimmied backward, eventually requiring 3 bridesmaids to help her pry the fabric loose. She disappeared upstairs in a flurry of sobbing and ruined silk. Daniel, looking utterly bewildered, followed her 10 minutes later. When he finally returned to the ballroom, the reception had devolved into an awkward murmur. His face was pale, his jaw tight with a barely restrained fury. He marched straight to the head table, bypassing his mother entirely, and leaned down over my shoulder. "You switched the chairs," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, letting the ice clink against the glass. "Did I? Don't play games with me. You humiliated my wife on her wedding day." I slowly turned my head to look at Elena, who was sitting to my right. She was softly dabbing her mouth with a napkin, looking genuinely concerned for Vanessa. She had not yet deduced the mechanics behind the torn dress, and I fully intended to maintain her innocence until the night was over. "An interesting choice of words, Daniel," I murmured, keeping my volume low enough to avoid Elena's attention. "Humiliation." Daniel leaned closer, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the back of my chair. "You are going to walk upstairs right now, and you're going to apologize to her." "No," I replied, the word dropping between us like a heavy stone. His expression faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion piercing his anger. He was entirely accustomed to me yielding, to me smoothing over rough edges whenever Elena tearfully begged me not to fight with our only child. He expected compliance. He found a wall. "Dad, I swear to God." "Take your seat, Daniel," I instructed, my tone flat, devoid of any paternal warmth. "Your guests are staring." He swallowed hard, casting a nervous glance around the room before retreating to his seat. 20 minutes later, Vanessa made her grand reappearance. She was poured into a sleek ivory replacement reception dress, but her eyes were cold, calculating slits. She wore the chilling smile of someone actively plotting absolute ruin. As the dinner plates were cleared, Vanessa demanded the microphone from the DJ. The room quieted once more, an uncomfortable tension hanging in the air. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She paced slowly across the dance floor. "You know, families are deeply complicated things. Some people lift you up and support your dreams, and others, well, others become deeply bitter and jealous when they see their own children succeeding where they couldn't." Several guests at the peripheral tables nervously shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward Elena and me. Elena reached under the table, her trembling hand seeking mine. I squeezed her fingers, keeping my eyes locked on the bride. Daniel stared intensely at his half-eaten filet mignon, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Vanessa continued, her gaze fixing on our table. "Fortunately, Daniel and I are starting entirely fresh. We are leaving the old baggage behind. We are thrilled to announce that we'll be moving into the Ridgemont estate next month. Daniel's father has generously agreed to transfer the deed to us as a wedding gift." Elena turned toward me, her brow furrowed in utter confusion. My pulse slowed to a methodical rhythm. I had, in a moment of weakness months ago, agreed to let them live in the Ridgemont Ridgemont property rent-free for a single year to save for their own down payment. I had absolutely never, under any circumstances, agreed to transfer legal ownership. Then Vanessa leaned into the microphone and delivered the final fatal clue. The phrase that confirmed this entire situation had escalated far beyond a cruel, childish prank. And, she beamed, Daniel's logistics company has secured massive new backing and will soon be expanding, taking over the entire penthouse floor of the Westbridge Tower. A polite smattering of applause broke out, but inside my mind, a klaxon alarm began to wail. The Westbridge lease negotiation was highly classified. The current tenant hadn't even publicly announced their bankruptcy yet. Only 3 people on the planet knew the Westbridge penthouse was secretly available: myself, the distressed property owner, and my corporate attorney. Daniel was certainly not one of them. There was only one physical location where the Ridgemont deed drafts and the Westbridge lease documents existed in tandem. Unless Daniel had bypassed the security system in my private home study, I gently released Elena's hand, offering her a reassuring smile. "Excuse me for a moment, my love. I need to use the restroom." I walked out of the ballroom with measured steps, refusing to run. The moment the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, sealing away the music, I pulled out my phone and dialed my attorney, Marcus Hale. He answered on the second ring. "Robert, it's 10 o'clock on a Saturday. Shouldn't you be doing the chicken dance?" "Marcus, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice echoing in the empty, marble-floored corridor. "I need you to log into the mainframe right now. Freeze everything scheduled for Monday morning. Halt the Ridgemont temporary occupancy draft, suspend Daniel's quarterly trust distribution, and put an immediate embargo on the Westbridge lease." The line went completely dead for 5 agonizing seconds. When Marcus finally spoke, the casual banter was gone. "Robert, those are nuclear options. You think Daniel is compromised?" "I think," I growled, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows into the dark estate gardens, "that my son has forgotten exactly who owns the table he is currently eating at. I need you to pull the digital security logs from my home office, specifically Tuesday night between 7 and 9. Elena and I were out for our anniversary dinner." "Give me 10 minutes, Marcus said and hung up. I stood in the hallway, the distant thump of the bass vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I was not just a father dealing with a disrespectful son anymore. I was a CEO dealing with corporate espionage from within my own bloodline. My phone buzzed. It hadn't even been 10 minutes. It was an email from Marcus. The subject line was blank. I opened the attached video file, and the true nightmare began to unfold. The video clip was grainless, high-definition footage captured by the discreet lens I had hidden in the crown molding of my home study. The timestamp read Tuesday evening, 7:42 p.m. The heavy oak door to my sanctuary creaked open. Daniel stepped inside, plunging the room into the harsh glow of his smartphone flashlight. He moved with a practiced, hurried anxiety, heading straight for the alphanumeric keypad securing my filing room. He punched in a code. The light flashed green. He had bypassed my security. He knew the master override. A moment later, Vanessa slipped into the room behind him. She wasn't nervous. She looked thrilled, like a scavenger who had just found an unlocked vault. While Daniel stood by the door, acting as a lookout, Vanessa marched straight to my mahogany desk. She began yanking open drawers, pulling out thick manila folders marked with the Aegis Holdings emblem. I watched, my breath trapped in my lungs, as she laid the documents flat beneath the desk lamp. She pulled out her phone and began methodically photographing page after page. I zoomed in on the screen. The documents were unmistakable. They were my private trust statements, the deed to the Ridgemont property, and most damning of all, the preliminary, highly confidential sale evaluations for Hawthorne Hall, the very venue she was currently dancing in. They hadn't just been mocking Elena's pearls. They hadn't just been planning a cruel prank with superglue. They had been meticulously measuring the dimensions of my estate, calculating the exact weight of the carcass they planned to pick clean. Another email from Marcus chimed in. "Robert, I dug deeper. Check the call logs for the trust management firm. 2 weeks ago, Daniel called them. He bypassed standard protocol and asked to speak to a senior partner. He asked a hypothetical question. If something were to happen to both of my parents simultaneously, would my marital status accelerate the liquidation and distribution of the estate? He classified the inquiry as proactive estate planning. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Marcus had initially found the question slightly morbid but legally harmless. But paired with the video of the theft, it painted a horrifying portrait. My son wasn't just impatient. He was actively preparing for a future where Elena and I were out of the picture, ensuring his new wife had full access to the capital. I forwarded the security footage to a secure private server, deleted the trace from my phone, and pushed my shoulders back. The man who had walked out of the ballroom was a heartbroken father. The man walking back in was the chairman of the board. I slipped back into my seat beside Elena just as the waitstaff began pouring the champagne for the formal toasts. Vanessa was holding court, laughing brightly, one slender arm possessively looped through Daniel's. She looked across the room and caught my eye. Emboldened by her earlier speech, and perhaps mistaking my silence for submission, she raised her crystal flute in the air, pointing it directly at me. "To new beginnings," she mouthed across across the room, a wicked glint in her eye. I picked up my glass of water. I did not break eye contact. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. To consequences, I whispered to myself, raising the glass an inch higher. Even from 50 feet away, I saw her falter. Her smile cracked, the glass freezing halfway to her lips. She recognized the look in my eye. It was the look of a trap snapping shut. At exactly 9:30, the DJ's voice echoed through the speakers. All right, folks, it's time for a very special moment. I'd like to invite the bride and her father to the floor, and the groom with his lovely mother for the traditional parent dances. Elena smiled warmly, wiping a tear of joy from her eye. She began to push her chair back. Across the room, Daniel approached our table. He didn't look excited. He marched toward us with an impatient, rigid hand extended toward his mother, looking exactly like a man forced to do community service. Before Elena could fully stand, I reached out and placed a firm hand over her wrist, gently pulling her back down into her seat. Robert? She asked, startled. Not tonight, my love, I said softly, my eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, his hand still extended in midair. He frowned, his face flushing with irritation. Dad, what are you doing? Don't start this right now. Everyone is watching. I assure you, Daniel, I am not starting anything, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the soft intro music. I looked past him, toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. They swung open, revealing Marcus Hale. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, entirely out of place among the wedding tuxedos, carrying a slim, black leather folder tucked under his arm. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. I'm finishing it, and I walked past Daniel without a second glance and marched directly toward the stage. I signaled the band leader, drawing a finger across my throat. The live music sputtered and died, the sudden silence causing a physical ripple of discomfort to wash over the 200 guests. Conversation collapsed into scattered, nervous whispers. Daniel spun around, his eyes darting frantically from me to Marcus, who was calmly walking down the center aisle. Dad, what the hell is this? Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. This, I projected, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling without the need for a microphone, is the part of your wedding you neglected to plan for. Vanessa surged to her feet at the head table, her jaw tight, her hands balled into fists. Someone turn the music back on. Security! No one moved. The venue staff, acting on my prior instructions, stood perfectly still. I walked up the 2 small steps onto the stage and took the microphone from the bewildered DJ. I looked out over the sea of faces, family friends, business associates, people Elena had known for decades. Then I looked down at my wife. I intended tonight to be a celebration of my son, I began, the heavy silence amplifying every syllable. I intended to pass the torch. Instead, I learned that my son and his new bride chose to celebrate their union by attempting to publicly humiliate his mother. Elena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Robert, what are you talking about? I looked her directly in the eyes. The industrial glue placed on the head table, Elena. It was meant for your chair. Vanessa poured it, and Daniel stood guard at the door. All the color drained from Elena's face, leaving her looking fragile and ghost-like. She slowly turned her head to look at Daniel, her eyes wide with a betrayal so profound it seemed to steal her breath. Daniel panicked. He stepped forward, raising his hands defensively. Mom, no, it wasn't like that. It was just a joke. It was a stupid joke, I swear. Elena looked at him as if he were a complete stranger who had just struck her across the face. A joke? She whispered, her voice trembling. Vanessa, sensing the tide turning drastically against her, snapped. She grabbed a microphone from the head table. Oh, for God's sake, grow up! Nobody was going to die. It was a harmless prank. You're ruining our wedding over a dress. No, Vanessa, I countered, my voice dropping to a glacial calm. You only wanted a 60-year-old woman to tear her dress open in front of 200 people. You wanted to break her spirit, but that's not why I stopped the music. I nodded to Marcus. He had reached the audio-visual desk. He pulled a cable and connected his tablet to the ballroom's massive projection screen, normally used for childhood photo montages. The chair, I continued, was just the appetizer. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light over the dance floor. The high-definition security footage of my home study began to play. A collective gasp, much louder than the one caused by the torn dress, echoed through the hall. There was Vanessa, 20 feet tall on the screen, standing inside my private sanctuary, frantically photographing my financial documents while Daniel held the door. The ballroom erupted. Guests began murmuring, pointing, some even standing up to get a better look. Daniel lunged toward the AV desk, his face contorted in panic. Turn that off! Marcus, I swear to God, turn it off! Marcus smoothly stepped out of the way, but he didn't touch the cable. A second clip seamlessly began playing. This one showed Daniel late at night, keying the master code into my locked filing cabinet, pulling out the corporate files for Aegis Holdings. I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly toward the center of the dance floor, meeting Daniel halfway. I reached out and took the slim black folder from Marcus. I opened it and pulled out 3 crisp, heavily notarized documents, slapping them face down onto the pristine white icing of the multi-tiered wedding cake. The Ridgemont house, I announced, my voice cutting through the rising clamor, remains securely in my name. The deed transfer was a fiction you invented. Secondly, finally, your quarterly trust distribution has been permanently suspended, effective immediately, invoking the felony misconduct clause you blindly signed 6 years ago. Daniel staggered back as if I had shot him. His face went an ashen, sickly gray. And finally, Daniel, your logistics company occupies my building. Your lease expires in exactly 60 days. It will not be renewed. You can't do that, Daniel stammered, his eyes darting around wildly, realizing his entire empire was constructed on my foundation. We have contracts. You can't just take it all away. I don't have to take it away, I replied coldly. I already did. 3 hours ago. Vanessa abandoned her post at the head table and stormed onto the dance floor, her eyes blazing with panic and fury. She grabbed Daniel by the lapels of his tuxedo. What is he talking about? She shrieked. You said the house was ours. You said the expansion was fully funded. She turned her wrath on me, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. You're a monster. You're destroying your own son's life over a stupid chair? I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a hollow pity. No, Vanessa, I said quietly. The chair merely exposed your character. The corporate theft finished the job. Marcus stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. Mrs. Sterling, Jr., copying confidential property sale documents and attempting to use them as collateral in private financing applications triggers both massive civil liability and federal fraud reviews. Earlier this afternoon, your husband emailed one of those photographed documents to a private lender, falsely listing the Ridgemont property as a pledged asset. Marcus tapped his tablet. That email provided the timestamp and the proof. Vanessa stared at Daniel, her mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. She realized in that terrible, suspended moment that she had not married a rising tycoon. She had married a man driving a stolen car toward a cliff. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. By Tuesday morning, the private lender, alerted by Marcus, completely canceled Daniel's expansion financing. By Thursday, Daniel's 2 minority business partners, terrified of the impending fraud investigation, held an emergency vote and officially removed him as managing director, citing his illegal pledge of assets he didn't own. I made good on my word. I filed a devastating civil claim against them both for unauthorized access and blatant misuse of confidential financial records. I didn't care about the money. I wanted the legal injunction on their records forever. Vanessa, who had dramatically quit her high-paying marketing job a week before the wedding, fully expecting Daniel's imminent expansion to elevate them to the elite class, woke up to a nightmare. She discovered that the luxury downtown apartment, the dual-leased sports cars, and the catastrophic $100,000 wedding debt were all solely in Daniel's name, and Daniel was suddenly unemployed and facing eviction. Their fairy tale marriage, built on a foundation of greed and superglue, lasted exactly 4 months. Through it all, Elena never once asked me to intervene. She never begged me to rescue him, to pay his lawyers, or to soften the blow. She spent a week crying in the garden, mourning the boy she thought she had raised. But when the tears finally stopped, a new, steely resolve replaced them. That was how I knew the deepest wound, the agonizing, lifelong hope that her son would eventually respect her, had finally scarred over. 6 months after the disastrous wedding, I initiated the sale of Hawthorne Hall. It was too tainted by the memory of that night. We took the massive proceeds from the estate sale and established the Elena Sterling Foundation. It was a robust scholarship program specifically designed for older women returning to higher education after sacrificing their early years to raise families. On the gala opening night of the foundation, Elena stood beside me on a stage. She wore a stunning, deep sapphire blue dress. Around her neck, resting proudly against her collarbone, was a simple string of freshwater pearls. As the first 5 scholarship recipients took the stage to shake her hand, the auditorium erupted in genuine, deafening applause. She was glowing, radiant, with a purpose she had been denied for too long. As we stood there in the flashing lights of the photographers, my phone buzzed in my tuxedo pocket. It was a single text message from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. Dad, it's me. I lost the apartment. Can we please talk? I didn't reply. I simply held the phone out to Elena. She looked at the screen. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, the old motherly instinct flickering in the dark. But then, she looked out at the women she was helping, women who actually deserved her grace. She handed the phone back to me and gave a single firm shake of her head. Not yet, she murmured. I didn't delete the message. I left it there, a digital monument to the choices we make. Forgiveness, I had finally learned, is a beautiful concept, but it is not the same thing as surrender. You can love someone from a distance while actively refusing to let them hold the knife. Later that night, the gala ended. We walked out the rear exit of the venue into the crisp, cool autumn air. Elena slipped her hand into mine, her fingers interlacing with mine seamlessly. Behind us, the hall lights glowed warmly against the night sky, a testament to something good built from the ashes of something ugly. Ahead of us, the winding suburban road was completely quiet, and for the first time in 30 years, as we walked toward our car under the stars, so were we.